Good morning. Good morning. You're here at the Humanists of Greater Portland meeting. I'm so glad you're here. We're in for an amazing program today. This is part 2 of Dr. Strand's series on the neurobiology of religion. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech, but I must state that the views expressed by myself, our reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. Usually right now, I kind of read what is a humanist and read this little blurb, and that's our tradition, but I'm going to do something a little different today. HGP has been quite active recently, and I want to share with you what humanism is in action. And one of those things is the fact that Unchained promoted a bill. They were a speaker here. Frida was a speaker here, and they promoted an Oregon bill to end child marriage. And we sponsored we gave testimony. HGP members gave testimony. They wrote letters, and I'm proud to say that Senate Bill 458 has passed both the Senate and the House, Oregon House, and is sitting on Governor Kotek's desk right now. And we're very hopeful after this Memorial Weekend that she'll sign it. So that's humanists in action. That was a cool thing. Yeah. Another thing is the speaker came and talked about Blood Work Northwest, and said, boy, we wonder if we could do a blood drive, or, wouldn't that be fun? And got the connection with Friendly House and Blood Work Northwest and Friendly House and the Humanists of Greater Portland got together. And on June 18th, there's going to be a blood drive here at Friendly House, and that's humanism in action. So I think we need to, we need to just say, there's a spark, there's a new spark in our organization, a lot from some really cool fellows that are don't have gray hair yet, but there's a new spark here at the Humanists of Greater Portland, and I just want to celebrate that. It makes me feel so good. So, what's the other, honey? Oh, forgot that. So Greg Brochet came and gave a speech from Portland Clean Air. And he said, I need a piece of equipment. It's really important that I have this piece of equipment. And our board said, well, how about if we give him, he needs $5,000. How about if we give him $2,500 if our members or the greater community can come up with $2,500? Well, we're $2,000. We've got $500 to go. We've got till June 15th. And that's another way that the Portland Humanists are making a difference. So we're pretty cool, guys. We really are. We're great folks. All right. Thank you, El, for reminding me of that. So our reader today is one of our favorites, Laurent Beauregard. I hope he's there. Is he there, Dave? Okay.
The reading this morning is actually a song or a poem. It's by Ken Nordine. Some of you may have heard of him. This is called Mr. Blister. And I will basically do a sing-along. I think you'll find this amusing. Mr. Blister by Ken Nordine. Here goes. Says the messy Mr. Blister, fidgeting dumb and he's smart, hiding his home and ha-ha. Where does his silliness start? See him wear his silly sulcos he, flims of his flam telling lies. Slow motion he plays inside, giggles eats foxily slide. It's just not a silly Western, troublesome kick of a chick, honest to goodness to evil, thinly disguising her thick. Here drum a number on our hero, rickety tickety talk. Blinker then quicken your thinker. Nobody's minding the clock as the world goes round and round and round. Just take the blister's blemish, could be his unlucky star, being full of rainful of your fault, betcha there's hardly a scar. Precaution golly, intelligent folly, blistering wet has gone dry, fester and blester and blemish, and any others can cry. As the world goes round and round and round, the world goes round and round. I see nothing to blister, fidgeting dumb and smart, hiding his hokum and ha-ha. Where does his silliness start? That is Ken Nordean's Mr. Blister.
Thank you, Laurent. Okay. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sarah Strand is returning to HGP to do part 2 of her 3-part series on the neurobiology of religious experience. Dr. Strand is an associate lecturer at the psychology department at the California State University, Sacramento. She received her Ph.D. in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and has been lecturing about religion and neuroscience since 2010. Dr. Strand will be presenting today on the neurobiology basis of out-of-body experience. Welcome, Dr. Strand. I've been really looking forward to this, so thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be back again. The last time that I was here, it feels like it was about a year ago, but it was only 4 months ago at the start of my spring semester. And now here we are again at the end of my spring semester. So it's really lovely to be back. All right. So yes, this is part 2 of my sort of 3-part series talking about the neurobiology of religion. Back in January, we talked about the evolution of religion, and today we're going to focus on religious experiences. And I'm really excited to be back and talking about this. One of the things that I discussed in my presentation in January is that I do have a psychology of religion class that I created. And this topic that we're going to be talking about today, there just really isn't a lot of time to dive deep into it like we are today. So these presentations are really the only chance I get to talk about some of this really cool stuff. So here is an outline of what I hope to get through in the next 45 or 50 minutes or so. I do want to center our discussion around the psychology of religion. And so I'm going to define what that is, because I'm hoping that that's going to help us make sense of why I'm focusing on what I'm focusing on today. And then I'll move into talking about what exactly an out-of-body experience is and when they happen. We'll talk a little bit about how out-of-body experiences happen. That's when we're going to talk about what's going on in the brain. And then I want to talk a little bit about what exactly makes an out-of-body experience religious, because not all OBEs are interpreted as religious. And then I'm going to offer some overall conclusions, and then I'm sure you're going to have some wonderful questions like we did last time. So to start off, one of the things that I want to really center us on is this idea that we can study religion from a variety of viewpoints, and none of them are, overly right or overly wrong. They're just different ways to examine this phenomenon that has been present in human culture since human cultures began. And so the psychology of religion is different than, say, philosophy or history or sociology or anthropology, because it doesn't focus on questions about what beliefs are right or wrong or what beliefs can be proven or falsified. Instead, it's going to focus on the concept of God that exists within the mind of believers. But then we also need to include what's going on in the mind of non-believers as well. And one of the ideas that I like to impress upon my students in psychology of religion is that though I'm posing that question as sort of a dichotomy, the belief is more on a spectrum. One of the more recent Pew Research Forum surveys showed that people who describe themselves as non-believers are not all atheists, not all agnostic, not all humanist, and in fact, some non-believers do believe in God. So that's a whole nother can of worms that we can certainly chat about either in the Q&A or at a different time. But the goal really of psychology of religion is that it's only one aspect of how we study religion, and that we're focusing on what's going on in the mind of believers, and I would also say non-believers as well, acknowledging that that's not a dichotomy, that it's more of a spectrum. And that also what unites us as humans is that we all have these three basic psychological needs. And I'm really boiling that down to very simplified language because, of course, we have more than three psychological needs. But as it relates to belief, as it relates to finding philosophies that are larger than ourselves, um, if you don't like this word self-transcendence, there are different ways to describe that. Essentially, what unites us as humans is that we all have this need for individual life purpose that we could describe as wholeness, that we also all have this need for community, this sort of sense of belonging with other people, and that we also have questions about our existential meaning, the ultimacy. Why are humans here? Why is the planet Earth here? Where do we fit in the grand scheme of things? Basically, to understand the world around us and the role that humans have in it. And these, as a psychologist, map really nicely onto this very well-known hierarchy of needs. Wholeness is going to describe that sort of pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization. Community is going to be there at that third tier of love and belonging. And what I want to really relay is that um, these needs exist for both believers of all religions as well as non-believers. Humans are humans, humans have human needs. And so if we think about this question of the neurobiology of religious experiences, and we're focusing also on what's going on in the mind of both believers and non-believers, then this question about examining God in the mind can be examined using multiple methodologies. I talk a lot in my class about self-report surveys. This is a great way for us to identify what's going on or how people think about their belief or lack thereof. Surveys are what revealed that some non-believers still believe in God, right? So what's going on there? There's also observational studies, which are really interesting, where you kind of go out in the world and watch people doing what they're doing. We can, of course, conduct laboratory experiments where we're posing different questions. We have a control group and an experimental group. There's some really lovely questions where, people are given a passage, a little passage. One of them says that it's from an ancient scroll, and the other says it's from a Bible. And even though the passage itself isn't different, the being told the source of that passage changes how people behave towards others. So there are some really great experiments that use basic classic lab control experimental group. But what we're going to talk about mostly today are some of these questions that relate to brain imaging. So we've got functional magnetic resonance imaging, we've got positron emission tomography, and there's also technology called SPECT that also enables us to track what's going on in the brain. And so when we use the term neurotheology, we can talk about not just the relationship between brain and religion, but also that continuum from religious to secular that I was just talking about. Okay, so as we're talking about neurotheology, we're looking at that relationship between brain and religion, but also examining that continuum that I've just been alluding to. And one of the things that I'm going to focus on then, as we sort of are focusing down why we're going to have the conversation we're going to have today, an out-of-body experience is an experience in which a
Very
person
interesting.
perceives the world from
She's
outside of
she's
their
talked to us
physical
before.
body.
Today it's about the psychology of religion.
Looks like someone needs to
She
be
really
muted.
knows it.
Okay, there we go. We're looking at out-of-body experiences, which is when a person perceives the world from outside of their physical body. Now, these out-of-body experiences are associated with different interpretations about what happened after people are no longer having that OBE. And so it's these kinds of things that I'd like to ultimately end with in our conversation today. But something that's really important to keep in mind as we're discussing OBEs is that they can be a transformational experience. The OBE experience surpasses any of, different rituals, the different activities or other religious behaviors that people might engage in on, I say, a daily basis. And because people interpret these experiences as either religious or not, it provides a really wonderful opportunity for us to examine these differences and discuss the implications from the perspective of whether the individual is a believer or not. Okay, so one thing that I like to say when I'm giving these presentations is that my goal when relaying this information is not to say that a certain group of people is right or wrong, or a certain group of people has a better grasp on the truth versus not. My goal is to shed some light on the spectrum of human experience, and to try to sort of normalize the different ways in which different people satisfy those core psychological needs. That we as a human population vary tremendously, V-A-R-Y, not V-E-R-Y. We vary tremendously. And so it's not surprising that we'd have different strategies to meet those goals. And so that's really the goal of today, is to talk about this very specific experience and what's happening in the brain, and then how that gets explained by different people. So let's talk about what out-of-body experiences are and how they happen. An out-of-body experience, as I said, is an experience in which a person perceives the world from outside of their physical body. And this is generally an experience that's going to involve that sensation of floating outside of one's body. This term, OBE, was originated by G.N.M. Tyrrell. He was a British mathematician, physicist, radio engineer, but also parapsychologist, which during this time of psychology's birth was not unusual. Psychology as a discipline didn't really become a discipline on its own until well after people had been studying psychology for a long time. And so often people came to this field from other trainings, from other disciplines. The term out-of-body experience replaced the term astral projection, because it allowed scientists to study the phenomenon and remain free of subjective concepts like the soul. So astral projection or spirit walking were left behind, and out-of-body experience was this term that started to become used more often. And there are 5 common characteristics of OBEs. And you're going to see in some of these I have NDE added to the end of it. That stands for near-death experience, because there are some characteristics that tend to occur more often in near-death experiences as opposed to just out-of-body experiences. But there's a lot of overlap. If you're kind of imagining the Venn diagram of NDE and OBE, there's a lot of overlap between the two. And so I'm going to present these characteristics as common for OBEs, but just know that some of them are more likely if you're having a near-death experience. So a sense of release from the body, we've talked about that a lot. A feeling of peace and connection with the universe, a movement down a dark tunnel, the vision of a bright light, and then the vision of deities or other people from their lives. These tend to be the 5 most common characteristics that people report once they've had that out-of-body experience. So the next thing, so now that we kind of have an idea of what an out-of-body experience is, next I'd like to talk a little bit about when out-of-body experiences occur, so we have a bit of a better understanding of that. I'm going to talk about 3 whens. This first one is that near-death experience. So individuals that are experiencing cardiac arrest or some other kind of traumatic medical emergency, there's evidence to show that different brain waves change their patterning and are often associated with sort of a collective surge around the time of that near-death moment. And then, as we know, people who don't end up dying and do come back to tell us about what they experienced are experiencing some of those common characteristics that we just talked about. So that's one type of way in which these out-of-body experiences can occur. Another way is during what's called the hypnagogic or the hypnopompic sleep states. So hypnagogic is what happens when we are awake and then falling asleep, and hypnopompic is when we are asleep and then we are waking up again. I'm not going into this in this presentation, but there are different stages of sleep, going from light to deep sleep to sort of REM sleep, and we cycle through those repeatedly over the course of the night. And so when we are coming in and out of some of those deeper stages of sleep, there are certain patterns and certain things that are happening in the brain which can coalesce into an out-of-body experience. So that's another sort of stage when our brains can be sort of moving between different states, and certain areas of the brain that I'm going to talk about in a second are sort of turning on and off and engaging and disengaging. And if you are awake enough, if you aren't like fully asleep, then you could possibly experience something akin to an out-of-body experience. Now, the third one that Hal and I were actually talking about just before the talk began is that out-of-body experiences can also occur when taking certain drugs. I have the example here of ketamine because I'm going to sort of show you some nitty-gritty neuroanatomical processes that won't take too long. But I wanted to just sort of give you an idea of why certain drugs can lead to those out-of-body experiences. Ketamine is not the only drug in which consuming it will produce out-of-body experiences. But that's the one I'm going to focus on for this image. So ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic drug, and it's used frequently in medical and veterinary practices, but it's also a drug of abuse. And a high percentage of ketamine users regularly have these out-of-body experiences, and it's because of this NMDA channel. NMDA channels are spread around the brain. These are not specific to out-of-body experiences, but rather specific to action potentials that are going to occur anytime the brain is processing information or logging a memory or just engaging in whatever it is we're doing at the time. What you see on the left-hand side there, this is a closed NMDA channel. That means that there's no excitatory, no ions that are flowing from outside the cell membrane, which is pictured above this gray bar, to the inside of the cell membrane, which is pictured below the gray bar. And you can see that the NMDA channel has lots of different binding points. So you see here, this is a magnesium ion. Here's a spot for an excitatory amino acid. We've got zinc, we've got glycine, magnesium down here, a polyamine. But then you also see this PCP spot. This is, a place for like basically dissociative drugs to bind. Now, this doesn't need to be bound in order for the NMDA channel to be activated. In fact, anytime the excitatory amino acid binds, so you see glutamate being bound here at that EAA site, that's what prompts this NMDA channel to open. So we have a closed channel here on the left and then that open channel here on the right, which is going to enable the ions that are important for either excitatory action potentials or inhibitory action potentials to take place. And that's going to depend on the combination of ions that are flowing in or out of the cell, which we don't need to worry about neuroanatomy right now. I'm happy to answer questions about that if you'd like to know a little bit more about that afterwards. But the idea, the whole point of why I'm bringing this up is that a drug like ketamine can bind at that site, which essentially blocks the NMDA channel from performing normally. And when that NMDA receptor is blocked, there are a myriad of consequences. One of them is an altered state of consciousness and those sort of body self distortions that are associated with an out-of-body experience. And so at the beginning of this slide, I said that ketamine users are often experiencing out-of-body experiences, and the NMDA channel is one explanation for why. Anytime you are hearing about individuals consuming drugs like PCP or even ayahuasca and having those out-of-body experiences, it's going to be something like this that is responsible for that. So I just wanted to show a little bit of the neuroanatomy that could be involved when we're talking about, consuming certain drugs that are leading to these experiences. The main goal of this section was just to talk about when out-of-body experiences happen. So as I said, we've got those near-death experiences, we've got those near sleep state, hypnagogic and hypnopompic, and then also certain drugs that can produce these experiences. So next, I want to talk about how they happen. What exactly is happening in the brain that leads to this specific type of experience? And to relay this, I'm going to introduce two specific brain areas and the interaction between the two of them. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the angular gyrus, which sits at the intersection of this temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. I have it outlined here in red. The picture here is Dr. Olaf Blank, who was trying to figure out the source of a woman's intractable epilepsy. So essentially what he was doing was stimulating different parts of the brain while she was awake. And the brain doesn't have any pain receptors. So stimulating the brain was not going to result in pain, but it was a way for him to identify, where exactly is the source of this woman's sort of intractable epilepsy. Intractable meaning resistant to any kind of therapy that was being tried. But in so doing, Blank stimulated the parietal lobe, specifically that angular gyrus area, and unexpectedly produced an out-of-body experience. This woman started reporting that she was feeling like she was leaving her body, floating up out of her body, and almost seeing herself from this elevated position. So he accidentally stimulated the out-of-body experience, and the right side of our temporal lobe is important in that sort of visual spatial cognition or awareness. As I said, that angular gyrus sits at the intersection of the temporal and parietal cortices. You could hear about it referred to in the literature as the temporoparietal junction, also the angular gyrus, and it's implicated in tasks, not just visual spatial, but also language, number processing, memory retrieval, attention, as well as theory of mind, which we talked about a little bit back in January. So the right side then is responsible for that visual spatial cognition, and the left side is sort of implicated in the awareness of our own body. So if the left parietal lobe is responsible for the awareness of the space of one's own body, the right parietal lobe is responsible for the sense of the physical space in which our body exists. And so it's the interaction between the right and the left parietal lobe, specifically at that angular gyrus, that enables us to accurately move our bodies from point A to point B. I mean, think about if you are pouring your cup of coffee in the morning, right? You have to be aware of where your body is in relationship to that coffee pot. If you're reaching your hand towards the handle of your pot, you have to know exactly where your hand is in relation to that pot in order to grip it, and then where your cup is in order to be able to pour it, right? Without a knowledge of where our body begins and ends and where our body is in our non-body space, it makes it really hard for us to engage in any actions in which we're using our body to manipulate our environment. So, okay, sorry, I have that up there. So left awareness of our own body, right awareness of our non-body space. And it's the interaction between these two that allows us to move our bodies through that physical space. But remember those common characteristics of an out-of-body experience that I talked about a few slides ago. A sense of release from the body, that feeling of peace and connection, and then that fifth one, the vision of deities or other people from our lives. Now think about it. If the left side is the awareness of our own body and the right side is awareness of non-body space, if that connection is disrupted somehow, whether it's because we are coming in and out of different phases of sleep, whether because we're having a near-death experience, whether it's because we're taking different drugs, if that communication that enables us to know the difference between our body space and our non-body space is disrupted, then what that sort of feels like is that we don't know where our body ends and everything else begins, which means we sort of start to feel like we are connected to everything around us. And that sense of release from the body right? We are sort of separating from our body because we don't necessarily have that awareness anymore of where our body ends and the rest of the space around us begins. And so we start to sort of rise and float and come out and separate and apart from our body. You'll also notice this image again is the sort of looking at the back, right? So you're looking at the back of your head. This back area here is the occipital lobe. That's where our visual cortex is. And you can see that the angular gyrus also kind of connects with or sits right next to that visual cortex. So if that starts to become sort of, if the connection between parietal and temporal starts to be disengaged, whether through hyperactivity, not so much epilepsy, but through additional activity, you might start to get a little bit of extra activation of the visual processing part of the brain, where we start to see things, whether it's just light or actual individuals. That starts to happen because there's some activity happening in our occipital lobe that is absent of that sort of external stimuli. There is some evidence to suggest that the people that are seen are reminiscent of, who is important to us, or whether they are, alive or not, but who is important to us. So some people report seeing recently or long passed away relatives. Young children have reported seeing things like Big Bird, and things along those lines. But that visual cortex, the area of our brain that processes visual stimuli, when activated in the absence of external information, starts to produce these visions of these different deities or other people from our lives, or just simply light, which is another often reported characteristic. So we've got this idea then of when out-of-body experiences occur. We also have now an idea of how they occur in the brain, right? We have this disruption of the angular gyrus, that connection between the awareness of our own body and the awareness of our non-body space. But we still don't have a great answer about what would make an out-of-body experience religious. So that's the next question that I want to answer. And I think I want to, in the interest of time, what I have on the next 4 slides are testaments of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and give you just a very quick summary of what I was intending to show on each of these slides without reading fully everything that's on them, because this is going to sort of lead us into this: why are some out-of-body experiences tagged as religious and why some of them are not. So this was an example that I was giving you of somebody who had a near-death experience and then cataloged it as religious. And what I have bolded here is that the person was rescued by a slowly spinning clear light, and there were also thousands of beings that were dancing around this person. So there was sort of the presence of an entity, really, is what I want to highlight in this religious NDE. Now, if I go to the next example, which is a non-religious near-death experience, there's nothing really about an entity or a person outside of this person hit their head on a rock, and he was seeing his daughter, but his daughter had been with him when, actually no, the daughter wasn't with him. But he was seeing sort of his daughter like going to school, essentially. So it wasn't so much an angel or like a slowly spinning orb or anything along those lines. It was very much like a person from that individual's current life. The next is a religiously themed out-of-body experience that happened as the person was waking up. So that's the hypnopompic stage of sleep as you are waking up. And you see that this person was visited by an angel, right? So some kind of entity. And then the last one, which is a non-religious hypnagogic OBE, this is when you are awake and then falling asleep, that hypnagogic stage of sleep. You see that there was, again, felt the presence of some beings, and then the person sort of hurtled and crashed back into their body and was lying in bed. So we seem to have this theme of there being some kind of entity in the experience, but what the kind of entity that is being reported is a little bit different when we're talking about a non-religious versus a religious experience. So that's the question here that I'm trying to pose to you. What exactly determines how an out-of-body experience will be interpreted in terms of whether it will be religious or not? Now, it's not so simple to say that, well, a person who is religious is going to interpret them as religious, and a person who is not religious will not interpret them as religious. There are plenty of accounts of people who are not religious and have an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience and then decide to become religious. But there are also instances in which somebody who is religious has an NDE or OBE and they may not change their life philosophy necessarily, but they don't interpret it as having encountered an experience with a god or an angel or something along those lines. But what is important in these experiences is that sensed presence, that sort of entity that's in the room. What characteristic does that entity embody? In one of them, it was just the daughter, right? It wasn't anything like an angel or the floating orbs of light or anything like that. So what are the characteristics of those entities? And what's interesting when we talk about the other part of the brain that the angular gyrus sits at, we talked about the parietal lobe, now I'm focusing on the temporal lobe. The right side of the temporal lobe is associated with this sort of nonverbal visual spatial memory, where the left side is where that language and verbal memory as well as our sense of self is located. So the temporal lobe's involvement in religious interpretation of an out-of-body experience was also discovered sort of accidentally. This one by a man named Michael Persinger, who was asking the question, if the left side of the brain sort of houses our sense of self, then what is the right side equivalent of that sense of self? You know, we see from the functions of the temporal lobe here that the left side has sort of language and verbal memory, and the right side has sort of nonverbal visual spatial memory. But we also see that the left side houses our sense of self. And so the question can be, is there a right side equivalent of that sense of self? Hopefully that makes sense. Sort of in terms of how I'm setting up these videos. I'm going to play a couple of clips for you so that you can actually see what this experiment was like, what Persinger's goals were in trying to identify that right-sided sense of self, and then what the results were from one sample subject. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video. We tested this right before, so I'm hoping this is going to work okay.
Dr. Michael Persinger. He runs the Mind Consciousness Lab in the basement of the Science Building at Laurent University.
Our primary research is involved with understanding the relationship between brain structure and function and experience. And more specifically, is there a biological and brain basis to some of the concepts that are called the God belief and the God experience?
Dr. Persinger is a neuroscientist. He believes that God resides in our brains. In fact, he even thinks he knows in which part of the brain.
One of the things we were really excited about was what's the brain basis of the sense of self? After all, that's the great human definition, who we are. And we knew it was tied to language and left hemispheric processes. But then we asked the question, what's the right hemisphere equivalent? So we have this second sense in the right hemisphere. And when you experience it, it's called the sense presence. And we think that's the prototype of the God experience.
All he has to do to create this God experience is place this yellow helmet on his subject's head. He calls it the God helmet.
Okay, so we're going to put on the helmet. Our approach was very simple. If you want to study the brain, then let's look at the brain in the laboratory with an experiment. Just follow the experience and let it come to you, all right?
After After putting Domenica into a sealed chamber with no light, the research team will monitor her brainwave activity for 1 hour. In a few minutes, Domenica's brainwaves start to order themselves into a relaxed pattern. Then Dr. Persinger activates a magnetic coil sitting over the right side of her brain. It's no more powerful than a hairdryer, but it's designed to focus its energy on a small set of brain cells in the right temporal lobe. Those cells, he believes, will stimulate in Domenica a sense that someone or something is present.
Okay, so that's sort of the setup to this experiment. We've got this idea of a sense of self, which is typically tied to the left hemisphere, language function. We've also got this idea that the right side equivalent of this function can be potentially stimulated by this God helmet, which I think can still be purchased on Amazon. Like if you really wanted to like try this at home, I think there's a version of it available on Amazon, the big yellow helmet. When people are when that part of the brain is very mildly stimulated with that magnetic stimulation, the right temporal lobe, has a response. Let's just say that there's some kind of phenomenological experience as a result of that stimulation. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a couple of slides, but I want to impress upon you now that what you are seeing is just one participant. But Persinger repeated this study on something like 450 participants and found some remarkable patterns in the responses that people had when undergoing this stimulation. Not all the pieces are being presented in terms of the patterns that he found in this video, but I will talk about them a little bit more in future slides. So we've got this experiment with this question about, what is the right side equivalent of the sense of self? What is the sensed presence? How do we experience it? And is that, as Persinger said, some kind of prototype for the God experience? So let's go ahead and see what the results were in this next clip.
Domenica?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm about ready to come in. Just relax.
For 1 hour, Domenica has been shut inside the chamber without light or sound, alone with her thoughts. And perhaps also with God?
And it says you felt the presence of something.
Yeah, there's other things around me.
Okay, can you describe them?
They were just bodies of nothing. Not doing anything, just chilling.
How many were just chilling? She actually counted. Did you see her move her hand?
Yeah.
She was actually recreating it.
Yeah.
More than 80% of Dr. Persinger's subjects, whether they are religious believers or not, sense a presence from the God helmet.
When the right hemisphere was being stimulated, she felt the presence of things around her. 5 entities that were faceless.
I couldn't see, down. My body was, up more, so I could only see, above.
Oh, above?
Yeah.
Okay. She had these marked intense feelings of visual sensations in always the upper visual field. Did you notice that? That's typical of the temporal lobe being activated. I see you checked here that the experiences did not come from my own mind. Can you describe that?
I was, watching myself. So it wasn't me feeling I was watching myself lying on the road. I didn't feel like my head was attached to me.
You felt like what?
Nope, my head wasn't attached.
Okay, so you felt like your head was detached and somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so more than 80% of the participants, whether religious believers or not, sensed a presence from the God helmet. So not everybody experiences that sensed presence, but a lot of people do. Other key characteristics of this participant's experience that should sound familiar based on what we've talked about so far was that she was sort of watching herself from outside of her body. Her head didn't feel as though it was attached. Those are very similar to an out-of-body experience. But then the added attribute of feeling like she was not alone, that she was surrounded by faceless entity, this also is familiar based on two out-of-body experiences that were interpreted as religious. So this begins to help us understand why some people might interpret their out-of-body experiences as religious and others might not. This whole idea that the sense of self is tied to the left side, and that this sort of sensed presence can be activated where we experience other people in the room, and that's what's tied to the right side, sort of helps us grapple with what exactly is happening when an individual experiences an out-of-body experience, but also potentially a near-death experience. Helps us sort of wrap our mind around what's going on. But then what's unique, what's individual about those experiences are the characteristics that are being assigned to that entity. You know, in Domenica's experience, they were sort of faceless floating entities. And some of the other reports, they were angels or orbs of light. Whereas other experiences, they were, you know, like the person's daughter or somebody in their present current life. Those are all very different characteristics. So I say this as an overall conclusion, but I'm going to provide in these overall conclusions some additional pieces which will help us sort of, I think, form a better picture of what's happening neurobiologically when someone has a religious experience compared to just an out-of-body experience. And hopefully now that distinction makes a little bit more sense because that's sort of where we're going. The first key point that I want to bring up is that these sensed presences, these out-of-body experiences, even near-death experiences, are not specific to believers alone. That these are things that are experienced by both believers and non-believers. And that makes more sense when we start to think about these experiences happening because of disruption of certain brain regions. All humans have the same basic structure to their brain, and so all humans then have the capability of having these out-of-body experiences. This paper here is what I was referring to a couple of slides ago. Sorry, this paper here, where the Persinger and his colleagues reanalyzed all of the data that they had collected over a period of like 10, 12 years, which was a total of 407 subjects across 19 experiments, and showed that the magnetic configuration itself was not responsible for the sensed presence that the participants experienced, but rather it was characteristics such as the subject's exotic beliefs or suggestibility, things like transliminality, which is something that's described as hypersensitivity to psychological material originating in the unconscious and or the external environment. There are some individuals who are hypersensitive to like changes in barometric pressure and things like that. Those individuals who have higher degrees of transliminality are going to score highly on inventories such as the personal philosophy inventory. That's the exotic beliefs and suggestibility piece. But also the temporal lobe sensitivity scale, which is going to assess essentially different characteristics that are associated with a temporal lobe that may be more likely to have these out-of-body or rather sensed presence experiences, but also the epileptic disorder spectrum. So hopefully those of you in the room, I'm going to sketch this really quick. I think this is my pen tool. Hopefully those of you in the room remember your normal distribution scale from statistics or methods or something along those lines, where the top part of this curve, let me change this because that was probably really hard to see, where the top part of the curve represents kind of the mean where most individuals lie. So if we're talking about any of these scales, then there's going to be an average score where most people are going to be within 1 or 2 standard deviations. anybody at this end of the scale are going to be considered probably more interested in exotic beliefs, more suggestible, more sensitive on the temporal lobe sensitivity scale, more having more characteristics of epileptic disorders. People on this end of the spectrum are going to be considered, lower on those exotic beliefs or suggestibility scales, lower on temporal lobe sensitivity, and lower on the epileptic disorder spectrum. What Persinger and his colleagues identified is that, believe it or not, the people who tended to have these sensed presences were more likely to be on this end of the scale, that they were more likely to have higher scores on those surveys that they measured. Let's see if I can erase all ink. Okay. So there's that bit of it, that there are some personal report scales that can help us explain some of the variability we see in individuals who are having these experiences. But then if we don't like to use these self-report surveys, there's studies that support the idea that something like the dopamine D4 receptor gene, which is a polymorphic gene that has variability within individuals in terms of how many repeats there are on what's referred to as the promoter part of the gene. You see here individuals that have 2 repeats. Sorry, the ink is still. I can turn this off. Okay, they had 2 repeats, 3 repeats, 4 repeats, etc. When this sort of neurobiology of an individual is examined, we see that typically people have about 4 repeats on this specific gene. And if you have, so that would represent kind of the average, right? The height of that normal distribution curve. Individuals that have less than 4 repeats tend to score lower on that spiritual transcendence scale, which is associated with this degree of transliminality. And people that have more than 4 repeats, greater than or equal to 4, tend to score higher on that spiritual transcendence scale. So again, there is individual variability in how suggestible individuals are, how sensitive individuals' temporal lobes are, different characteristics associated with epilepsy, but also when we come down to even just this dopamine D4 receptor gene, this is the gene that sort of creates the D4 receptor to which dopamine binds, we see that this also is associated with individuals who may be more or less likely to experience those sensed presences, which then lead to interpretations of whether or not that experience was religious. The idea here that I want to convey on this slide for both believers and non-believers are capable of this is that there's just tremendous individual variability that can be identified not just with sort of cognitive beliefs and processes, but also down to the way in which our bodies are built, the way our bodies are interacting with the world, beyond simply what we personally would describe as our personal beliefs. And I find that, as a behavioral neuroscientist, I find that super compelling. The second key point that I want to convey is that our brains, if you sort of look at this image, here is sort of the dawn of the first sort of human species, but Homo sapiens are, which, the dominant human species on the planet right now, the only human species on the planet right now, only came into existence about 200 to 300,000 years ago. And yes, it's true that our brains have evolved substantially from our earliest ancestor millions of years ago. And our brains are even different from our most recent human relatives, the Neanderthal. But the Homo sapiens sapien brain that came into existence about 200 to 300,000 years ago hasn't super changed a lot, right? Which is kind of sobering to think about. Like, how is our world now different than the Homo sapiens sapiens of 200,000 years ago? So if our brains have only slightly changed in the last, let's just say generously, 200,000 years, then it seems reasonable, based on kind of what I talked about back in January with how our cognitive systems process the unknown and make sense of the unknown. If our brains haven't super changed a lot in 200,000 years, then we could sort of expect that the kinds of experiences that I just described, that Persinger explicitly tested, were also happening to our relatives 200,000 years ago. And if you knew nothing about neuroscience, as only recent humans know, then how else would you attribute these experiences that you've had? It's a really easy leap to say that they come from some higher spiritual power beyond ourselves. So that's another key point that I think is really important to keep in mind, specifically as we're addressing the neurobiology of these religious experiences. I often get this question, when people hear me talking about this topic. Okay, so if we know that these out-of-body experiences and why people tag them as religious are explained by phenomenon in the brain, then that means they're not really real, right? These experiences are only products of our brain. Well, that comes into a question then of, how do we know exactly what is real? Remember that the psychology of religion is focused on examining the representation of God, or the lack thereof, in the mind of believers versus non-believers. And so OBEs and the sensed presence do correspond to real neurobiological events at the temporoparietal junction, at that angular gyrus. And the interpretation of those events shows individual variability, not just based on self-reported characteristics, but also based on some neurobiological characteristics that can be examined separate from what individuals self-report. So sort of think about then what's happening when you, sitting there in the room or wherever you are joining us from Zoom, think about what happens in your brain when you look at this picture of a cup of hot chocolate. Chances are, if you're looking at that cup, there are increased activities happening in your visual cortex because you are looking at a visual stimulus. Your brain is cataloging the angles, the colors, the shapes, the parts of the plate that are occluded, and trying to make sense of what it is you're actually looking at. But if you really focus on that picture, that recollection of what that cup of hot chocolate smells like is actually going to be activating areas of your olfactory cortex as you remember those smell memories. You might actually be tasting it too. I mean, maybe you're really focusing on those flecks of chocolate flakes. What if that was dark chocolate, right? You might be thinking about what that dark chocolate tastes like, and you're going to have some activation in your gustatory cortex as you think about what that tastes like. And then in addition, maybe you have some salient emotional memories of sitting in front of the fire with your family and drinking hot chocolate when there's snow coming down outside. Those emotional memories are then going to activate not just your hippocampus and your amygdala, but all of those other areas of your brain where those different sensory details are stored. Just because you're not actually holding that cup of hot chocolate and smelling it and drinking it doesn't mean that those areas of your brain aren't being activated. And that doesn't also mean that that experience of those memories, the actual taking in of that visual information, aren't real. Your brain is responding to those memories. Your brain is responding to that visual stimulus. And so it's one of those things that I talk about in my perception class as well, when we talk about our own experiences of pain. When we're describing our pain to our doctors, they ask us on a scale of 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, where's your pain? Because it doesn't really matter what the actual raw value of the pain is. What matters is what the person's experience of that pain is. And if someone's level 5 pain would be someone else's level 8 pain. That doesn't make the level 8 pain less real or the level 5 pain less real. It is that person's experience of their pain. And even if we don't talk about pain, if we just talk about color, no one has any idea what anyone's actual experience is of the color red or the color blue. We just know that we look at something and we learned as small children, we call that thing red or we call that thing blue, but we have no idea of what each individual's personal experience of those colors are. And so when we ask, how do we know what's real? We can't really verify what someone else is experiencing is exactly what we would experience in that same situation. We accept these things as part of the normal variation in the human experience, but it's harder for both believers and non-believers to accept that about religious experiences because we want to know what is real. So I'm going to leave you with these thoughts because I'm not coming to you with answers to life's mysterious questions. My role is to present information for you all to think about and for you all to ask questions about. And I'm happy to share with you what I have kind of concluded based on what I have personally experienced, but also what I have read in the literature and also the conversations that I have had with people over the last, I guess, 15 years since I've been talking about these things and teaching about these things. What have we learned so far in this talk? And I think I'm a little bit over time, so I will try to be quick with this. What do we know so far? We know that religion is present in every culture, in every society. In most people, the percentage of atheists and agnostics is increasing, but still believers do outnumber non-believers. And we know that there has been some version, we talked about this back in the evolution talk in January, we know that there's been some form of some kind of primitive religion since the dawn of humankind. We also know that our brains, after today's talk, we know that our brains are largely the same as our ancestors, that they produce similar activity during out-of-body experiences, that they can produce something called the sensed presence that can be interpreted in different ways, depending on the characteristics of those experiences. We've also discussed that personal philosophy inventories, temporal lobe sensitivity scales, epileptic disorder spectrums, the transliminality scale, as well as the dopamine D4 receptor gene helps explain some of the variability that people have when they are either having an out-of-body experience and also when they interpret that out-of-body experience. And I've encouraged you to sort of reconceptualize those interpretations and those experiences as not real or not real, brain-based versus, supernaturally based, but rather just a wonderful additional example of the spectrum of variability of the human experience. So where do we go from here then? And this is going to be a similar conclusion that I had, I think, at the end of the evolution talk, this idea that religion is not going to go anywhere. I don't have a strong feeling that humanists as a group want to get rid of all religion the way some community groups I've spoken to have suggested. So I don't feel like that's going to be like a burn when I say that religion is not going anywhere. But I'd like to sort of pose that it doesn't really need to go anywhere. Religion does provide some helpful resources and some helpful answers and some helpful outlets for people who need those kinds of things. Religion does provide wholeness, community, and ultimacy especially in ways that other groups don't do as well. This is a great conversation that I have with my students. Where do you get that existential meaning? It's not impossible to get other places, but it's really comforting and palatable and kind of easy to get from religion. Everyone has these goals of wholeness and community and ultimacy, but everybody accomplishes them in their own way. And there was this wonderful talk that's given by this guy named Bo Lotto. He has this TED talk about optical illusions that I stumbled across in my perception class. I really recommend watching it because it's a really fun video. but he says something about vision, not about religion, but about vision that I just found really transformative in my own sort of processing of this information. He says that the light that falls onto our eye, that sensory information, is meaningless because it could mean literally anything. And what's true for sensory information is true for information generally. There is no inherent meaning in information. It's what we do with that information that matters. Now, Bolata was talking about it in terms of how we interact visually with our environment and the evolution of our visual systems. But I propose that let's stretch that. Let's apply that not just to visual information, but let's apply that to religious information. And not just religious information, but the way in which humans meet these basic psychological needs. There is no inherent problem with certain strategies for meeting those needs unless someone is harmed. If someone's way of life and their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness is interfered with. But the vast majority of people who hold religious and non-religious beliefs have no intention of interfering with the life, liberty, and happiness of others. It's only a select few, and I agree that that's problematic for sure. So if science won't abolish religion, and science may be able to disprove myths such as creationism, but it can't provide hope for life after death, and science can't, at least right now, assuage fear and provide comfort, stability, and tradition, then one of the things that I would love to propose is that we extend our sphere of acceptance of those who may satisfy those basic psychological needs in a different way than we might. Try to expand that sphere of acceptance beyond simply ourselves. And so I'm going to leave you with this last video clip before I take some questions. Hopefully we still have time for this. Yeah. It's an Android commercial from 2014, but I just find it so beautiful and applicable to everything that we are experiencing right now, including what we've just talked about. So just give me 60 seconds to show this video.
You'll have it.
Remember back in school when you either invited the new kid over to your table or you didn't? If you did, that was a cool move. That was an and move. And moves take guts, but they can mean everything. Their and move is to put wings on a bicycle. Now, we fly. When enough people have an and view, the world changes. Forever. If you think about it, you're only here because of an and moment. Opening yourself up isn't easy. But when you do, it's hard to forget, because it leads to something new, something better. That's why we need this. And this, and them, and you. Yeah, you, watching this right now. Because everyone doing the same thing won't move us forward, but everyone doing their own thing, together, can.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your patience as I went a little over time.
Oh, Dr. Strand. You didn't disappoint, that's for sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for this. As a hospice nurse, I'm a retired hospice nurse. We saw frequently in patients who, to the best of our knowledge, might never have had an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience, and whose range of religious beliefs varied. But we saw the very phenomenon you're describing, the sense of presence.
Sue, I'm going to ask you to ask your
so
question.
Often that, let me finish my sentence. We would let people know that this was likely to happen. So, and this would extend over a period of days, weeks, which is a little different than what you're describing in terms of time.
Your question,
Can
please.
you comment? What's the neurobiology of that?
So you're saying that people had that sort of disconnection from their body where they were floating up above themselves that extended for weeks?
Not so much that as seeing the presence of people, family members, friends who had gone before.
Yeah.
That's what was common.
My guess is that if we think about how that brain is structured and we think about what's happening as somebody, you said they're on hospice and so they're dealing with medical trauma.
Near death.
Yeah, exactly. Chances are there's probably some of that disconnection or disruption of connectivity with that angular gyrus that is also pinging into that visual cortex. And so they may actually, and then we're talking about the NMDA receptor, which is also involved, that could also be disrupted. Chances are that's going to be those kind of constellation of things are going to produce visions of, people, things that are important to them in a more prolonged way while they are awake. That's I'm guessing just very quickly based on what you shared with me that's kind of what's going on. Yeah.
Even though it had never happened before in their lives.
Yeah, exactly. Because their brains are different. They're nearing the end of their life and their brains are processing that information differently.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hank here at on Zoom as well asked the question, why the spectrum of religious to secular rather than supernatural to natural?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wanted to answer it as soon as I saw it. So thank you for reminding me that it was there. I think that's an interesting thought question. I think that we could probably spend a half an hour talking about that. My kind of first reaction is that if we're thinking of a spectrum, and we have religious on one end and secular on the other, then what that makes room for in the middle are those individuals that self-identify as non-believer but still believe in God, right? That spectrum of religious to secular sort of makes room for that, where secular on one end means, presumably no belief in God, whereas religious on the other end does. I would say that supernatural to natural might have a little bit more overlap. Yes, we absolutely have individuals who 100% believe in supernatural explanations for life and death. And we 100% have individuals who believe in completely natural, non-supernatural explanations of life and death. But I think that there's a lot more overlap in terms of individuals who, may, for example, have religious traditions or behaviors or interactions as part of their day-to-day life and existence and culture that still very much have natural explanations for. I'm thinking Jewish people, I'm thinking Buddhists, I'm thinking Hindus, that may not necessarily have the same, that there's just I'm having a hard time doing it in a succinct way, but I just feel like in my mind there's a lot more overlap between supernatural and natural than there is between religious and secular. And again, I think we could talk about this for like a half an hour and sort of talk about our examples of why we think this is true. I think that's a beautiful thought question that I would love to spend more time on, but I don't think we have that time. But thank you for asking that. Yeah.
You're welcome. We have a questioner number 1, please, that friendly has.
Yes, I'm interested in why the sense of peacefulness and floating only a limited amount above our bodies, if that's tied into our body's sensed experience with gravity and our no expectation of what it should be to be further than a few feet from our body. Because it's uncreative. If you are truly released, why don't you float everywhere else and you don't?
Yeah, I mean, some people.
Ooh,
I'm echoing.
I'm echoing. You're okay.
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 Some people do go farther than just those couple of feet. I have heard anecdotal stories where people like floated out a window down the hall or something. It's true that the vast majority, like on average, are going to only float a few feet away. And I would say that that's a product of, our brain still being tethered to our body. Yes, it might be unimaginative. Yes, it would be wonderful to just like cut that tether and like go and, visit people that are, thousands of miles away. But I think that for the vast majority of folks that there's still that tether, the connection between our body and our non-body space might be dissolving, but I think it's not completely gone. And how many people, if you're comfortable, either raise your Zoom hand or raise your actual hand, because now I can see folks have had some kind of out-of-body experience like that. Yeah. So And I have two actually. Yeah, thank you, Gail. Thank you, Ada. Exactly. I have two. And when I had mine, I floated. I was laying on my couch and I floated around the corner and into my bedroom and then floated back down again. And I was followed by my dog who had died like 2 years ago. That was what happened to me. So I didn't stay within 2 feet. I kind of went around the corner and into my bedroom. But I think that part of that is just because our brains there's still that tether between our brains and our bodies. That's my quick answer to that. That's an interesting question.
Okay, questioner number 2, come on in.
Yes, I interpret what you're saying is that we imagine things based on your last graph as a way to remember the wisdom that we had to have passed down orally. There was no other way. And recalling your parents, visualizing your parents can help you remember what they taught you.
Sure.
Sure.
And
Yeah, question.
can it be that religion is just an emergent phenomena that comes, we got an extra power of recall and now it gives us religion, it's emergence, we have to live with it, but it's not the purpose, it's not the reason why the power is there.
So you're asking me a why religion? Why do we have religion? Back in the evolution talk, I was kind of starting at that question from like earliest humans, and I still think the reason why the earliest humans constructed the explanations for the natural world that they did still sort of apply now. It's just that we still have a lot of questions, but we have more answers to those natural phenomenological questions than our earliest ancestors did. So why religion? I think when I talk about this with students, community is their number one reason. Now, these students are, in their 20s, a couple are in their 30s. But community is the number one thing that they cite. It's not so much answers to these phenomenological questions, which is why organizations like Humanists of Greater Portland are so important. We all need community. We all need to feel like we fit somewhere. But another huge thing is that we have our own fear of death, of our own selves dying. But then often for the students in their 20s and 30s, they've had loved ones pass away, whether expectedly or not. It is tremendously hard to imagine living in a world without that important person present anymore. And so another way that religion can help cope, essentially, and sort of keep putting one foot in front of the other, is to provide an explanation of where that person went. And also, if we have a fear of dying ourselves, it can also provide an explanation of what's going to happen to us. Now, again, not all people need that explanation, but a lot of people do. So then when we get to the ultimacy, like what the explanation for why humans are here and why, the earth exists and those kinds of things, I think science is doing a pretty good job of answering a lot of those questions. So maybe it comes down to community and answers to the question about what happens when we die that will still remain the domain of these, supernatural explanations for those people who need it. I think the problem comes when people get mad that you don't think the same way they do.
Well, honey,
You've got too many questions. Yeah.
all right, thank you so much. Jeremy has a question that I'm just going to read. Are there dangers of disassociation or necessity to know oneself if people have near-death experience or use drugs that trigger that in the brain?
I mean, if we're talking about drugs, yeah, there are dangers to chronic use of drugs. That goes back to what Nancy Reagan, right? Like, I mean, don't do drugs.
Just say no. But I think he was meaning during the experience, are there dangers?
Yeah, that's what I figured. So I would say that, there's not a lot of immediate concern when an individual has an out-of-body experience, or, I mean, if it's near death, then yes, there's the medical concern. But if we're just talking about the basic characteristics of raising up out of your body and that kind of thing, it would be like ancillary concerns. Like, are you actually, like if it's hypnopompic or hypnagogic, are you going to sleepwalk and then injure yourself if you fall? Those kinds of things. But like in terms of what's happening in the brain, very minimal. I've heard no reports or anything about dangers from that. Usually it's the ancillary things around it that might be problematic.
Very good. Let's see. How about question number 3 here at Friendly House?
Go ahead, David.
I was curious, or is this a topic that you're doing research on, or just sort of an interest that you're teaching on? And then any thoughts on sort of the benefits of some religious practices for non-religious groups like ours? We do things like communal singing, for instance, sometimes. And yeah, just curious if you have any thoughts.
So question number 1, my position at Sac State is a teaching position, not a research position. So the types of research that I conduct are more on my teaching. So what I've done with this topic is in my Psych of Religion class, I will collect a series of, I'll do a pre-class survey and then an end of semester survey to determine whether or not my class has, for example, improved cultural humility, has improved tolerance to other groups of people. So that's the stage, that's the level of research that I am conducting. I am a behavioral neuroscientist, and so I was asked to give a talk 15 years ago on this topic, and I combed the literature and figured out what was out there and what had been published and created this talk, and it's been really well received. So I just keep kind of updating it and keep kind of combing the literature so that I can present and kind of collate this information for the general public. So my research is not on this, my interest is definitely on this, and I just come at the research in a different way. And then I think your second question was, is there a danger? Is there a connection about can you rephrase or repeat that second part?
It's just if you had any thoughts on like benefits of religious practices for like potentially even for non-theistic or
Got it. I would argue that we don't need to call it a religious practice. I would argue that we can call it a human practice. I think that people gathering to sing songs and tell stories and pass on knowledge and develop community has been around like that. In my conception, that religion is the natural byproduct of natural human practices. So I would say claim back the act of singing together and reading together and sharing stories together as a humanistic act and not necessarily a religious act.
Thank you. Question 4 here at Friendly House.
Frame this so it makes sense. My sense is that my conscious mind tells my subconscious what's important. And if my conscious mind says that my loved ones are really important, as opposed to it saying that a religious deity is certainly is important, then if I have the biochemistry and everything for this near body, out of body experience, the picture I receive in that out of body experience is going to represent what I've said is a priority. That does, is that making sense to you?
Are you saying is that true?
In a general sense, yes.
I would say that humans are powerfully good at convincing themselves of X when Y is true. I think that part of the reason, and I don't mean that, I am not meaning that as like, you're fooling yourself. I think that humans are really good at, there are things like confirmation bias. There are all sorts of characteristics that cognitively we do consciously in order to protect ourselves from any kind of dissonance or disagreement that our unconscious mind might be helping us process and work through that we might not be willing to acknowledge. Part of the flaw of self-report surveys is that we are relying on the conscious processes of the mind. And part of the advantage of laboratory experiments or even observational experiments or just flat out recording of the brain is that we don't have to rely on that conscious process. So while I think it's absolutely true that some people who have an out-of-body experience will see those people that you just described as important, I think it's also true that other people might see different things that they're afraid of, things that they, are trying to keep pushed back and don't want to think about. So I'm not sure there's as clean a separation in all people that you describe. That may very well be true for you personally, but that might not be true like humankind wide, if that makes sense.
If you're really frightened of something, that might be the thing that pops up. But if you are a believer in something, that might be the thing that pops up. Is that what you're saying?
So bringing it back, to the religious conversation. Let's say somebody, is in a particular religion and they're afraid of leaving that particular religion. One of the things that they might produce, whether in a dream, or I'm not exactly sure what that would look like in an OBE, but like what that would look like if they were going to leave. I mean, that might be one example of producing something that they would be afraid of.
Thank you, Dr. Strand. We've got from Ann Henderson. Is deja vu a facet of this? Is deja vu where you feel like you've lived this experience before? Is it kind of similar?
That is an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
Neurobiologically, it's not the same, but what are the neurobiological precursors of deja vu? That is a really interesting question that I don't have the answer to for you right now.
Okay, but it's well said.
Yeah.
I think we've come to the end of our time. It was perfect. I just couldn't thank you enough. And we've got one more coming up, I think.
Yes, in July.
In July.
Yeah.
Oh, soon.
I'll be doing neurobiology of morality in July.
Okay. Oh,
another fascinating topic.
And I'm so glad these are being recorded and available to the general public, to the world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes. And just that idea that that there's a reason that religion isn't an enemy at all. Good religion is very much like a good humanist meeting. Yeah.
Just a different way to solve the same set of problems, the same set of questions.
Oh, yeah. Could you just answer one, Richard?
Of course.
I'm just sorry, Richard. I didn't see you on. Richard, can you come in?
Yes. You mentioned the dopamine D4 receptor, the duplication that's present in it.
Yep.
Is there anything known biochemically about what that duplication actually does? Does it make the receptor more sensitive to dopamine, less sensitive to dopamine? I mean, obviously that would have a great effect on reward sensing and aspects.
Absolutely. So the dopamine D4 receptor gene is just the gene that codes for the dopamine receptor. And so the number of repeats that the promoter region has is not necessarily going to be associated with the sensitivity of the receptor, but perhaps the plethora of receptors that are being produced, and that would absolutely change sensitivity and would change I guess motivation for reward and those kinds of things.
Actually, it looks like that repeat is in exon 3, not in the promoter.
It is on exon 3, yeah.
It's in exon 3, so it's not in the promoter region. It's actually in the coding region of the gene.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're right. So either I picked the wrong picture, or I when I was reading the paper, I snipped the wrong, because oftentimes I look for pictures and they might not exactly match on to what the article is saying. But I find it really helpful when I'm talking about neuroscience to be able to show kind of an example. I was excited I found a DRD4. I was showing the serotonin transporter gene for a while because I couldn't find a DRD4 picture. So I found one. But you're right. I'd have to go back to the original paper to remember which specific region. But my notes say it's the promoter region, so I'm guessing the picture is wrong.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for